Rebel Within. Written by 𝗂𝒃𝒆𝒍. Narrated by Derek Scholes.
𝗤𝒊𝒃𝒆𝒍. I jumped behind a mass of cacti and activated subversive stealth as my companion, 𝗤𝒍, hovered above my head. Her wings were spread to keep her aloft, even though she could just as easily float while curled into a ball.
"It's tracing your centriole, Adrian. You've got about 10 seconds before it comes over the ridge,"
𝗤𝒍 sent. Our telepathic connection and her invisibility made it easy for her to spy while I stayed in hiding. My short brown hair and tan skin would once have been my only reasons to believe I might remain invisible. When the system arrived, I had given up my humanity to become a polymorph, able to change form and hide in plain sight. Now, my carefully reconstructed human appearance allowed me to fit in, and I was grateful for it. My best friend, 𝗂𝒊𝒄, caught my eye and offered an encouraging thumbs up as he crouched behind a drop-off. He held his soul-bound swords ready to attack. As a level 21 twin-blade defender, his job was to block the level 60 𝗤𝒆𝒄𝒻 on my tail, preventing it from hitting me as I lured it into our trap. The creature had been prowling the mountain above our remote boarding school's property for the last few days. We had decided to trap it on our own terms instead of waiting for it to surprise us. My mana ticked upward as I waited for the signal to run.
"It's here! Go!"
𝗤𝒍 swooped toward the path I'd already mapped during our practice run. I activated environmental barrier, and the concealing cacti collapsed around me, flattened by a surge of mana. My body absorbed the plant's fluids in a revitalizing rush as the residue bonded to my skin for an extra few points of protection. Using speed boost, I leaped across the deeply carved stream bed at the cliff base and clambered upward.
"Left! Stinger incoming!"
𝗤𝒍 sent. I dodged along a narrow, crumbling ledge, and a burst of stones rattled against my armor as the tail struck beside me. Already running low, my mana drained rapidly, forcing me to release environmental barrier before the fibers could revert to shredding my skin. A cascade of thorns rattled toward the dry stream bed below. When I glanced down to check my progress, I realized the 𝗤𝒆𝒄𝒻 had made it partway up the cliff behind me. 𝗂𝒊𝒄 balanced on its back, his sword slicing at the joints of its tail. Hoping to distract the creature, I leaned to spit my own venom into its face. It jolted back, lost its grip, and skidded onto its side in the crevice below. I jumped to safety as 𝗂𝒊𝒄 sprang away, leaving the stinger dangling by a thread. He flung himself behind a massive boulder as 𝗄𝗄𝗄 launched Smite. A wave of light erupted from the earth beside me. On its own, the area effect spell wouldn't have caused much damage to the 𝗤𝒆𝒄𝒻, but the cliff was another matter. A pulse shuddered through the ledge beneath me as the surface almost seemed to liquefy, and the truck-sized rock at the top tilted precariously. Dust billowed over the scene as a series of loud snaps, followed by a deep rumble, filled the air. I scrambled to find an unaffected location as my perch cracked and shuddered. When the air cleared enough to see again, I gave a sigh of relief. The landslide had pinned the 𝗤𝒆𝒄𝒻 in the crevice, so even the lower-level kids could safely participate in the kill. Its tail segment still swung violently free of the rubble, but 𝗂𝒊𝒄 was already in motion to continue his initial task as the others ran to back him up. 𝗄𝗄𝗄 lit up. As a level 19 holy warrior, her armor of God skill coated her in literally shining mana armor, and she drew her radiant sword perk from storage. Her golden ponytail bounced as she jumped down the hillside to join the rest in bashing the writhing creature to death. I relaxed into my new role, keeping an eye out for anything that might be lured in by the battle while everyone was distracted. 𝗤𝒍 curled her lizard-like tail around my neck, offering a running telepathic commentary on the fight below. I tuned her out for the most part, assuming our plan would continue to work. We had enough experience by now that I knew everyone fought well as a team, and it was rare to have a moment of privacy to consider my situation. I was beginning to feel more and more useless as everyone leveled. My morphed claws weren't strong enough to pierce the level 50 or higher monsters dominating the area. Frontline fighting wasn't my strong point anyway. I needed some kind of ranged weapon that would mesh well with my skills, and all the guns were taken. At least my class would never paint a glowing target on my back, but hiding wasn't of much help in a fight. Several of our party members cheered over gaining a level when the 𝗤𝒆𝒄𝒻 finally died. Distracted from my thoughts, I looked to see if anyone had poison debuffs for me to purge, but everyone was already regenerating, some with the help of Marcus's minor healing. Cher's armor faded, and she wiped goo from her hands onto her ragged jeans as she found a perch where she could rest and keep watch with the others. Somehow, she still managed to look like a model, even while covered in muck. "Anything useful?" I swung my legs over the edge of the cliff as Mr. Sanders activated his Use What You've Got skill to check for additional resources. He was our token teacher, sent along so the rest could imagine they were trying to keep us safe. Thankfully, he'd done a lot of hunting and hiking over the years, and happened to be one of the few adults who treated us like equals. His rich, dark skin was dripping with sweat, drawing muddy lines through the pale dust coating his shaved head and muscular torso. He'd have made a terrifying warrior, but everyone loved how his logistic class skills gave him the ability to break a carcass down to the parts that would be most useful to our crafters. He gestured for me to climb down. "Nothing we'd risk consuming since you poisoned it. Thanks for that, by the way. The damage over time was a big help." I shuddered. "The thought of eating bugs is just nasty." "You've never tasted crab, have you?" He laughed and flicked through a screen, linking me in so Sume could review the options. "We'll use some of the meat for our cockroach herd. There are also several useful crafting components and a new toxin for you. Sume might know if any of the rest could be worth more than our current stash. We won't unearth the whole corpse this time." I jumped from rock to rock back down the cliff, carefully avoiding the unstable area, then absorbed the venom sac with a touch. My dimensional lab would break it down and record its components later. Having a racial resistance and the ability to reproduce toxins meshed well with my toxic apothecary class, even though I could only secrete one toxin at a time. Sume became visible and, as usual, took a moment to preen, enjoying everyone's admiring glances. Sunlight skimmed her black scales and wings with a shimmering rainbow. She had plucked the daydream of having a wyvern companion from my mind when I'd chosen her as my first perk, and she decided the form suited her.
"Keep the pincers," she told Mr. Sanders. "They're the most likely to be valuable. I'll need upgrades from a shop to be more accurate."
She disappeared again, unable to maintain visibility for long. Mr. Sanders nodded respectfully toward where he'd last seen her, then turned to direct the others. "Let's finish up and head back before the light fades." After wincing at the sight of 𝗂𝗉 and a few of the others chopping into the creature, I hurried away. Ever since they'd learned I could secrete poison, I wasn't allowed to help with harvesting. I couldn't decide whether I felt grateful to avoid the disgusting task or excluded. "Sume, I could just head along the highway to search for a shop on my own. I'm not much use here. Maybe I could create a better role for myself."
"You need to bring a group."
Sume landed on my shoulders. I groaned in irritation.
"You'll need help to carry enough loot to purchase some of the school buildings and turn the property into a safe zone. If you bring along an administration class like Mr. Sanders, there's an additional discount, too. I could list even more reasons if you'd like."
I shook my head, feeling even more inadequate. Leaning back against the cliff, I practiced chameleon skin, taking on the color and textures of the stone behind me. Merging into the landscape this way took a lot less mana than morphic disguise, but I sometimes wondered if I'd forget how to recreate my own face one of these days. Giving up my humanity had saved me in more ways than by simply making it easy to hide and run. Ironically, it was the end of the world that had given me hope. After my own parents called me a liar for asking for help after Coach Watson assaulted me, I had taken off for the national park behind the mountains. I'd spent multiple summers learning jungle survival skills from my Ayoreo friends. Based on those experiences, I'd planned to live off the land until the mission stopped looking. Then the system arrived and gifted me with both the supportive companion I'd always dreamed of and the power to protect myself. After surviving a hellish first day, I decided to fight my demons by returning to help protect my friends. I'd made it back to the school a few weeks after the system arrived. Ever since, I had been waiting for the chance to expose Watson, but the creep always found ways to make himself look good. He'd somehow ended up with the missionary class, which had tipped quite a few of the teachers toward believing that the system must somehow be a gift from God. Knowing the man's true nature, I couldn't help but worry about the abilities he must be using. "Adrian?" 𝗂𝗉 was staring in my general direction, obviously unable to see me in spite of his perception skill. "Here!" I dropped chameleon skin and grinned as his eyes focused on me. It didn't take long to refresh my human appearance these days, since I practiced so often. I assumed everyone had guessed that my suspiciously spotless black pants, boots, and shirt weren't real, but I hoped they assumed it was a system clothing perk. Better that than the truth of a crafted adaptation of fur and thickened skin that had taken 2 weeks to design and remember. "We're heading back. You're covering the right." I nodded and moved to prowl alongside the party, keeping an eye out for danger as we hiked home, following the rambling animal trails between the thorn bushes and cacti covering the hillsides. Even before the system, many of the plants had been dangerous, seeming to jump forward to dig into our clothes and skin. Now that some had developed a truly conscious aggression, we had to keep an even closer eye on our surroundings. This time, we only encountered a giant chicken the size of a small car, which Mr. Sanders forbade me from touching for the sake of our food supply. At least standing watch resulted in repeatable quests, giving me XP for staying alert and warning of potential threats. Otherwise, I'd have started to worry about my leveling strategy. I needed to keep ahead of Watson. Fort Tin. We eventually crossed the highway as the sun was setting. After making our way through a maze of traps, we reached what we now called Fort Tin. Located halfway between the cities of Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, our boarding school had offered safety, spiritual community, and education. Only the children of missionaries and a few others who had paid extra for the privilege of an English education were accepted. The only reason so many of us had survived was that a random system fort had selected the walled-in hilltop that had once been our basketball courts as a safe zone. As the first sentients to find the location, we claimed it. This included a storage building and a game room where we used to hold class parties. With no way to get system credits, we couldn't expand our safe zone or purchase upgrades to fort defenses and facilities, though our crafters did their best with the resources at hand. Even the newly salvaged rows of bunk beds under ramshackled tin shelters didn't offer enough space for everyone. We were grouped into shifts for everything from meals and shower runs to rest times, making privacy a rare treasure. From the middle grades on up, we all took turns at watch, though the hunting and defensive parties tended to fill in the gaps whenever we were inside the walls so the watchers could catch a break. I waved at the group of little kids near the food shelter as our party dispersed. They had a card game scattered across one of the tables, and I sighed in relief to count all 7 still alive. Far too few of the kids had survived the first days before moving into the fort's brick-walled storage room, and the predators in our vicinity were only getting stronger. The ancient army truck that had been maintained by the school for decades rumbled up the narrow track toward the kitchen area. Its wooden bed bulged with yet another load of salvaged propane tanks, boxes of supplies, and a massive iron stove from the old dining hall. Everyone believed Chef Richards must be a true genius to have managed cooking for 63 people over an adobe fire pit, with only the puny game room snack stove for backup. I headed along the track between the shelters, knowing Rachel would be checking in with her brother at our watch post. A level 18 air mage, she'd been assigned to the party guarding the foraging team for the day. Taesong had promised to join us once he finished emptying his inventory into storage. "Any news?" Rachel was already in the tower gazing out over the shadowed soccer field, now a torn-up graveyard. Nobody else wanted the post for that reason, so our little group had claimed the responsibility. This section of the wall came with more privacy than the rest. Rachel's younger brother had already loaned her his mana rifle, a much-appreciated perk he'd chosen to go with his sharpshooter class. I glanced down at the hammocks we'd hung between the support posts and saw John already asleep, his face pale with exhaustion. He'd been keeping watch on his own since dawn in spite of missing half his sleep schedule the night before. I found it ironic that the system counted him as an adult already. The teachers still refused to treat me as one, even though I'd turned 19 a week ago. According to Sume, the system used the local age of adulthood to calculate, and the 𝗓𝗄𝗄 considered their children grown at 15. "They're planning a joint river run tomorrow," I told Rachel as I clambered up the ladder and slumped in the corner. Both of the fighting parties desperately want to bathe, and the rain barrels by the kitchen are nearly empty again. But no plans to search for more survivors or find a shop? Rachel shook her head. I scrubbed my face, irritated by the gritty feel of the ever-present dust. Mr. Sanders hopes the adults will come to an agreement tonight. I know he wants to believe they'll send us out because we won't survive much longer without system resources. Still, even his perpetual optimism can't help but acknowledge that at least half of them still imagine God will rapture us all into heaven at any moment. Taesong scrambled up the ladder and yanked himself onto the platform with one arm, clutching a fabric bundle in his other hand. Chef sent along some snacks since we missed lunch and dinner. Cold meat as usual, but Doña Maria's new mud oven has dried enough to bake the first batch of marraquetas, and we're her guinea pigs. Bread! We tore open the bundle and shared the still warm rolls, even waking John long enough to stuff his face with a treat. I breathed in the steam as I tore off a bite. For just a moment, I remembered how it felt to be safe and happy. Now all I need is a guarana. Rachel sighed. Too bad we finished the last of the soda weeks ago. I wrapped the remainder of my roll in its napkin and regretfully returned it to the pile of food. My old favorite still tasted just as good, even now that I wasn't human. Sumé had mentioned this was a system effect, associating my new body's experiences to a memory matrix my mind could comprehend. Still, the necessary internal organs no longer existed. I'd have to reach at least master class to fully replicate a human body. For now, to fake the process of eating solids, I had to use minor morph and create a pocket in my torso for anything my body couldn't absorb. Most fluids were easy to integrate, but solids led to debuffs to my health whenever I had to store them until I could manually eject the residue. You're not going to eat any? Taesong shook his finger at me. Just because a polymorph can survive on fluids doesn't mean you're not allowed to enjoy a treat with the rest of us. Eat the bread, okay? Let's just enjoy it together. He shoved the roll back into my hand as I continued to hesitate. I promise we'll eat the meat without you. I had to laugh at his long-suffering tone as I reclaimed my portion. I might feel a little uncomfortable later on, but with each bite, I felt more human than I had since the system changed my body. Taesong. Brilliant and familiar, the stars gazed down at me as I stood watch. Among them existed alien cultures and a myriad of worlds, similar to my favorite books and daydreams. Rolled in a blanket on the platform beside me, Taesong sobbed in the grip of a nightmare. He almost never slept in the shelters, saying he couldn't relax with everyone crowding together. I debated whether to wake him. These days, being awake wasn't much of a relief. He jumped and reached for my arm. Adrian, you still alive? Yes. With a sigh of relief, he pulled himself up to keep watch beside me. I had morphed my eyes to register the ultraviolet spectrum when night fell, and he had a night vision spell. Even without a moon, his skin glowed to my eyes, revealing his oval face and straight nose as he glared out at the field. It might be better to ignore the glimmering traces of tears on his cheeks for now. Together, we watched the mutated cockroaches feasting below. They'd attack any other creature attempting to sneak into their feeding grounds, giving us a chance to wake everyone up and get in position. I still can't believe we're using giant cockroaches as guards, he grumbled. Better them than us. True. He slumped against the wall and drew his swords. He'd once mentioned that holding them reminded him of the years he'd spent training with his father. You can sleep if you want. I'm going to be awake anyway, and it's only an hour or so till dawn. I won't need to hibernate for another 2 days. It felt like my words would create an impassable wall between us as I spoke. I'm too alien, aren't I? I wonder whether it's hard for everyone to be around me now. Everyone changed. So what if your race is different? You're still you. His voice softened. I feel like you becoming a polymorph is a promise, in a way. That was unexpected. I turned to face him, wondering whether I should ask what he meant. Sumé floated higher. Talk to him. I'll keep watch. Noticing my hesitation, Taesong shifted to face me. You mentioned you don't have a gender now, right? His narrow eyes seemed to pierce the darkness.
Well, yes. It's part of being a polymorph.
This felt dangerous, like I was standing on the edge of exposing my greatest flaw. Even if Taesong had always been more accepting of my oddities than anyone I'd ever met, I wasn't sure he'd accept this. He lowered his voice until even my enhanced hearing could scarcely pick up the words. It's like if the universe actually has whole races without gender affecting their relationships, maybe there's a place where I'd fit in too. But everyone loves you already. I couldn't understand how he could believe he didn't fit in when everyone had always admired him. That someone so popular chose to hang out with me had always felt like a rare error in judgment on his part. They'd reject me if they knew the truth. He curled in on himself, clutching his swords as if they were his lifeline. I'm not normal. I hesitated, unable to see his expression. His straight black hair had grown long enough to hide his face. Didn't seem that long ago that the teachers had the energy to enforce rules on acceptable hairstyles. There was a rush of motion below as the cockroaches encountered an invader. We tensed, but the creature was overtaken by the mob. I shivered. Without my toxins to cull their numbers below the control limits of Abuelo's herder class, even these low-level swarms could wipe out the fort within days. The silence between Taesong and I grew heavier as I reviewed our conversation.
Tell him your secret, and maybe he'll feel safe enough to tell you his.
Sumei sounded fed up with my hesitation.
He's already accepted your physical changes. If you can't trust him now, then you might as well admit you think he's a liar for saying he values your friendship.
Calling Taesong a liar grated on me as she knew it would.
Ugh, fine.
He jumped since I'd accidentally spoken out loud. Below us, the ropes of Rachel's hammocks creaked.
Attack?
I sighed.
No, it's nothing. Sorry. Sumei said something weird. Never mind. Okay, then.
We listened as she settled back into sleep. Eventually, her breathing evened out as we stared over the wall.
I don't want you to hate me.
I leaned in, keeping my voice low.
But can I tell you something I've never told anyone?
Taesong nudged my arm with his elbow.
I can't ever imagine hating you, Adrian. It's impossible. Well, the genderless thing? I chose to change race because of it. Whatever it is everyone else seems to know that makes them one or the other, my body it felt like puppet strings forcing me to be something I wasn't. I hated it.
My voice trailed off, and I dropped my forehead onto my hands where they rested on the wall.
In spite of everything, it's such a relief to just be myself now. I can change the parts that bothered me before.
After setting his sword across his knees, he flung his right arm over my shoulder and patted the back of my head as if I were a puppy.
That's all? I thought you were going to tell me you killed someone or something.
Not yet, I mumbled, thinking of Watson.
I hope I never have to either.
He chuckled.
It's strange to live in a world where that answer feels reassuring instead of creepy.
Forget trying to say things right. I had to get things out there one way or another.
I wanted you to know I trust you, in case you ever want to talk about your thing. I can't imagine hating you either.
Raptor. A chilling shriek disrupted our conversation as a larger predator charged into the mass of cockroaches. The creature tore into them, clearly too powerful for them to take down.
It looks like a velociraptor.
I yanked on the cord strung over Fort Tin, attached to a small bell by Mr. Sanders' bed, alerting our party back in the shelters.
This had better not turn out like Jurassic Park.
Taesong leaned over the platform edge to wake Rachel and John. We'd have to move outside to fight it off, since neither the maze nor the walls were enough to handle a direct assault from something this powerful.
It's crushing the cockroaches. Too dangerous. I'm going to lure it the long way toward the northern pit trap.
I morphed my fingers to increase adherence and began to climb down the wall. Be careful! Taesong leaned over the edge. We'll be ready! Cher's face appeared beside his, and I knew the rest of our party was close behind. Joachim would wake and buff them with night vision, and they'd run to the trap the short way. The cockroaches gave up the fight and scuttled back into hiding as I reached the edge of the maze. I hoped I could be irritating enough to distract the raptor from the fort. Half an hour later, I flattened myself behind a ledge to flash 𝗏 and repair the most recent hole the raptor had nipped in my shoulder. All the running and hiding reminded me of the early days when I'd been on my own. I glanced at my stats, noting the usual warning notification. HP, 75 of 490. MP, 67 of 500. Warning, mass at 5% below optimal range. 6% debuff to health and stamina. 𝗏𝒍 swooped up the gully toward her destination.
Run!
At least I had backup waiting. Even with speed boost for emergencies and my high endurance, the creature was far too close on my trail. Thankfully, its desire to make a meal of me blinded it to the party in hiding around the massive pit we'd dug a few days earlier. Dawn brightened the sky as I sprinted across a rigged slackline with the raptor nipping at my heels, the edges of my vision flashing with debuffs to health, strength, and more from losing too much mass to its attacks. Its shriek of anger stunned everyone but me when the twig and dirt cover over the pit collapsed, dropping it 6 yards onto sharpened stakes. I had coated them with blood thinner to increase their damage. I spent an anxious 10 seconds waiting while everyone recovered, trying to think of what I could do to help fight it off. The raptor scrabbled at the wall, creating pockets in the earth so it could pull itself off the stakes. Just before it reached the top, a series of stuns interspersed with rifle fire blasted it back down where Joe entangled it with a vine trap. 𝗂𝒊𝒄 and Mr. Sanders strained to swing a concrete platform into position, its base layered with jagged rebar spikes. The ramshackle tripod and pulleys creaked until someone released the catch and the platform dropped into the hole with a crash. Even this still wasn't enough to kill the raging raptor, which continued to struggle, its convulsions powerful enough to crack the concrete. 𝗏𝗫 started to chain smite every time it finished cooldown, hoping to drive the spikes in deeper before the lid crumbled completely. When it finally broke apart, the rebar remained embedded in the raptor's muscles, inhibiting its attempts to free itself. By the time the sun rose, everyone had a chance to get in on the battle while the creature nearly managed to escape the trap multiple times. We won in the end, but various team members lost an arm, a few hands, and half a foot in the process, reducing our fighting force for the time needed to regrow their limbs. Combat healer Joachim would have his work cut out for him when we got home. A quest update alerted me that I had received XP for warning of an invader before it breached our defenses, more for leading it away from Fort Tin, and a bonus for participating in a winning battle against a monster more than 30 levels above my current party's average. I had finally reached level 21, but it still wouldn't be enough power to protect everyone. I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we could survive on too little sleep while fighting attackers like this. 𝗏𝒍 nodded in silent agreement with my thoughts as we watched Mr. Sanders climb down to settle for the basic loot. The body was too shredded and poisoned to retrieve much else. I helped poison it further, and we left the remains for scavengers before heading back to Fort Tin, hoping to arrive in time for breakfast. On the way back, a mutated bush snatched at us with its branches. Thankfully, its last meal had damaged it enough that the fight was over quickly. Absorbing its mana-rich remains boosted my mass enough to eliminate the worst debuffs. Watson. Everyone's schedules shifted due to the injuries in our party, and the bustle that had arisen after our return finally died down. Chef Richards hovered over his stove, cheerfully whistling as he flipped pancakes for the second breakfast shift. I curled into a sunlit alcove beside the tin screen used to separate the dining area from storage, waiting out the cool down so I could morph. The kids were playing monsters and magic between the tables while their primary guardian, Miss Angela, helped with peeling and chopping cacti for lunch. One waved 2 sticks in the air, jumping from one shelter roof to another and pretending to be 𝗂𝒊𝒄. A screaming match broke out over who got to be 𝗏𝗫 until I intervened, suggesting they could both choose the Holy Warrior class. Nobody wanted to be me. I wasn't sure I wanted to be myself either. My torso had been warped into a lumpy mass by the cumulative effect of using minor morph to flash heal on the run. I'd borrowed 𝗂𝒊𝒄's jean jacket to cover the worst of it, but I still felt alien and ugly. I could shift into polymorph form any time, but nobody would recognize me. Even though my stats and skills were better in my new body, visibly showing myself as alien didn't feel safe. Since morphic disguise wouldn't allow me to repair my human form until 4 in the afternoon, I'd just have to wait. Behind the screen, I heard Watson's voice drawing near. As usual, I tuned in, listening for something that might give me leverage to expose him. "We need to move these boxes to the side to make room for the next load of salvage." I relaxed slightly. Even I had to admit his organizational skills were a big help these days, and this conversation wasn't worth my time. I almost tuned out until a familiar voice responded. "I'll handle it." 𝗉𝗠ng's presence was a bit of a surprise. I had assumed he'd been sent back to guard duty so John could finally get some sleep. Something clattered and the screen jolted. "You've been avoiding me, Tay." Watson's voice sounded muffled all of a sudden. "What?" I jolted to my feet, then dashed around the end of the screen and arrived to see Watson cornering 𝗉𝗠ng against a stack of boxes. "What do you think you're doing?" I wanted to scream, but my throat had been warped too, so I could only speak just above a whisper. Watson jerked back, stumbling dramatically. "I just tripped, so don't—" "Oh, it's you." He gave up on his terrible attempt at acting, and his eyes narrowed. He seemed to be calculating his chances of persuading me nothing was going on. A notification flashed in the corner of my eye.
He's using a mental healing skill on you. It's meant to help people forget traumatic memories from what I can tell,
𝗤𝗍 reported.
Your race is immune, but that is insidious.
𝗉𝗠ng brushed past him and hurried toward me, his face tense with repressed emotion. "Let's just go." I glared at Watson, whose face had already begun to smooth back into his usual mask. He must have realized from my expression that his spell hadn't dealt with the situation, because his brow furrowed and another notification flashed. "Unity failed. Congratulations! You have not been persuaded that everyone should overlook minor differences in opinion, such as the right of teachers to sexually assault their students, in order to work together." The modified description had 𝗤𝗍's fingerprints all over it, and I couldn't help but smirk. Watson's face twisted with frustration. 𝗤𝗍 flashed into physical form in front of his eyes for a moment, making him jump and hopefully interrupting any other spell he might have come up with.
Get 𝗉𝗠ng out of here. He's vulnerable to this creep even if you're not.
We ran down a narrow gap between the bunk shelters, agreeing on our goal without need for discussion. Moments later, we clambered up the side of our watchtower. Watson would never come this close to the walls. John glanced at us as we pulled ourselves onto the platform. "Welcome back." His face was far too young for the exhausted air of responsibility in his posture and expression. I gestured toward his rifle.
We're both free for now. Why don't you let me take over and go sleep on a bed for once?
If Watson hadn't had ulterior motives, 𝗉𝗠ng would have been assigned to the tower in the first place. John was far too tired to keep watch on his own. We watched in silence as he staggered toward the shelters. 𝗤𝗍 demanded we talk while she kept watch, but I hesitated to speak, uncertain of what to say. 𝗉𝗠ng broke the silence. "You've never liked Watson much either. Even before you disappeared, I saw you cross the entire patio once just to avoid walking near him. You're not the only person he's assaulted." I shuddered, unable to forget the memory of waking up in the dark with unexpected hands groping my skin. "He hurt you?" 𝗉𝗠ng inched closer so it would be easier to hear me, but he kept his face turned toward the soccer field. Going into the details after all this time felt like too much, so I skipped ahead. They claimed I was lying and a fellow missionary would never touch me. Everyone thinks he's so wonderful, you know. My own parents said I was ruining the reputation of a good man as some kind of sick joke. They've always thought of me as a rebel, that God had cursed them with me in order to test their faith. That explains a lot, actually. He glanced at me and shook his head. I knew something was going on. He was suddenly on extra work detail all the time and getting called in for disciplinary meetings for no reason I could see. I guess I can understand why you didn't tell me. I didn't say anything to you either, but still, knowing might have changed things. I should have warned you about him before I left. It felt like the regret would crush me with its weight. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I didn't talk to you either. He turned away, but I could still see his ears redden with embarrassment. It wasn't quite the same for me. Watson knew I was, he saw me watching the guy I liked. He offered to be a substitute. He said I'd have to marry a woman one day since my parents would never accept it. He wouldn't leave me alone, and I let him kiss me once on a bad day. After that, it was like I wasn't allowed to say no anymore. My jaw clenched with anger. What a creep! For a while, I thought I might as well just give in, since I'd never find anyone else who would accept me. I'll never get to be happy, you know. My crush was totally into 𝗫. It hurt to watch them together and think I'd never have that. And then... His voice broke on a muffled sob. It turns out Watson scared my best friend away too. His feelings were all too familiar, and 𝗬𝗍 murmured that Watson had likely preyed on us because of those similarities. I decided to focus on a safer topic. You like Jeremiah? I can see why. He was a lot of fun. Taesong scrubbed at his damp face and sighed. I can't believe he's gone. We fell silent. A familiar scent sweetened the air, and I scanned the horizon. I can taste the 𝗄𝗧 coming in. I'm glad they got the rain barrels installed. At least we have covered shelters now and enough blankets for everyone when the temperature drops. So what are we going to do? Ignoring my attempt to redirect the topic, Taesong sheathed his swords for the moment. He settled his back against the wall so he could face me now that we were finished with our confessions. I'm tired of Watson coming after me. I wish I'd never listened to him, but recently, even when someone sees him hanging on me, it's like they forget the next moment. And sometimes it feels like I should just give in and avoid making things more complicated since survival is what really matters. I just feel so guilty and disgusting all the time. That's a spell. I frowned and reviewed my logs. Apparently it's a group buff called Unity. It makes people ignore their objections and go along with the leader's plan for the sake of survival. From my perspective, he's essentially been spell drugging you, and everyone who sees him with you. With the description in front of me, I understood how the spell might even seem beneficial to some. He also tried some mental healing skill on me that was supposed to make me forget what I saw. Why didn't it work on you? Everyone else just blanked out. Taesong slumped back, grimacing in frustration. I shrugged, uncertain how to answer. 𝗬𝗍 exerted herself to become visible.
Having a non-standard mental makeup makes Adrian virtually immune to most mental and charisma-based influences.
She spun in place, floating far too close to my face.
But don't get cocky. You're extra vulnerable to those who know how to manipulate polymorphs.
Taesong smiled at the rare privilege of seeing her, unconsciously reaching to touch her. She floated closer and brushed her forehead against his fingertips before vanishing again. He clutched his hand to his chest as though she'd given him a treasure. If he tells them I'm gay, they'll probably just assume I'm the real problem. They've already proven they can't imagine a missionary might abuse his position. With his spells, I doubt they're capable of helping even if they might be willing to otherwise. He groaned and bumped his head against the exterior wall as if trying to knock a solution out of the adobe. I wish there was someone we could call in to help us.
Mr. Sanders is trying.
My recently acquired understanding of our party leader's character had finally convinced me that I'd always had more support than I assumed.
He hinted that he and a couple other teachers were investigating my situation before. Then, my parents called in and informed everyone I'm the embodiment of evil. I ran away before I heard what happened after that, but...
I trailed off, regretting leaving even more than usual.
Others might have helped us too, before the system gave Watson the ability to literally brainwash them. I'm hoping we can find a solution when we get to a shop, but they refuse to send anyone to search for it.
Taesong slumped against the wall and yawned, drooping with exhaustion now that the adrenaline had run its course.
We can't change the past.
Let's just talk to Mr. Sanders and keep an eye out to see who else we might be able to trust. We need to figure out how Watson uses his abilities and whether anyone else sees what he's doing with them. We'll go from there. And, Adrian," he rubbed a glimmer of tears from his eyes as he turned away, "thank you for not judging me." I patted his shoulder awkwardly, equally relieved that he hadn't assumed I was a liar. "Same here. Thank you." I scanned the field for a moment to give him the chance to calm himself, then pointed toward the hammocks below. "Now that we have each other's backs on this, you need a nap. I'll keep watch." 𝗬𝗍 hopped down to murmur something in his ear as I settled in to keep watch. I hoped she knew what to say, since I couldn't think of anything that might help him feel better. It was my fault for leaving him alone and vulnerable. Journey. Soon after sunset, Mr. Sanders hurried toward our group after the nightly teachers' meeting. His grin radiated excitement as he pulled himself over the edge of the platform. 𝗬𝗍 offered to keep watch for a while as we settled in to hear his news. "They agreed to send us out in search of the closest shop." He pumped his fist in a silent cheer. "At first, Watson recommended we just send you, Adrian." I tensed and glanced at 𝗓𝗁. Mr. Sanders' eyes narrowed when he noticed our expressions. It was obviously a bad idea to send anyone out alone. Everyone agreed we should send a small party and put me in charge. They left the rest to me. "So who's in?" I couldn't truly relax until 𝗓𝗁 was coming along. "Adrian, 𝗬𝗍, 𝗓𝗁, and..." He turned toward Rachel. "You, if you're willing. Your shelter spell will offer safety so we can stop to rest. And you three have decent teamwork since you all share responsibility for this watchtower." Rachel nodded, wrapping her arms around John as he shook his head, his face twisted in silent protest. "I do want to help." She caught John's gaze. "And, John, maybe I can find out what happened to Mom and Dad." John awkwardly hid his face against her shoulder. The poor kid was one of the few of us with a surviving family member close enough to rely on, and now we were taking his support away. Even if our mission was vital to everyone's survival, it couldn't be easy to accept. 𝗓𝗁 and I shared a muted sigh of relief when Rachel whispered encouragement to John. Watson's unity buff must have worked against his ulterior motives this time. We'd have to warn those we trusted to keep an eye on him while we were gone, but neither of us had noticed any signs of him targeting anyone else. Hopefully, we'd be back soon enough to prevent him from causing more damage. After giving us a few moments to accept the quest to find a system shop, Mr. Sanders continued, "We'll leave tonight. I don't want to give anyone a chance to change their minds. Chef Richards is putting together trail rations. 𝗓𝗁 and Rachel, you need to help me load up the best of the loot." He glanced in my direction. "Will you keep watch till Cher arrives? She volunteered since Joachim is mostly done rebuilding her foot. After she gets here, you're in charge of finding backpacks and organizing whatever supplies Joachim has for us." I nodded. He climbed down, gesturing for everyone else to follow. "John, come along and say goodbye to your sister. In a way, she'll be safer with us than you are here, you know. We'll always be using stealth abilities, which means we can sneak past anything dangerous." John didn't seem convinced, but passed me his rifle and followed obediently when they hurried to complete their preparations. Cher arrived with only a limp and a mismatched pair of shoes as a reminder of her injuries. She pulled herself onto the platform and accepted the rifle from me. I bit my lip trying to figure out how to start. "I need to warn you about something before I leave, but it's a bit awkward to explain." Cher gave me a keen glance, then sighed. "Is it about Watson?" It took me a moment to recover enough to nod. Did she think I had an unfair grudge against him? She grimaced. "He's been stalking 𝗓𝗁. I'm often on the same work group, so it's become pretty obvious, even if the adults seem to mysteriously forget everything they see. I've tried to help wherever I can." "He finally told you?" "I wish I'd noticed earlier." Frustration surged as I realized that, even as his best friend, I seemed to be the last to know. "Oh, Watson has been very cautious around you ever since you reported him." Cher noted my shock and sighed. "My parents heard rumors about the investigation and called to warn me to be careful.
They asked me to encourage you since your parents are idiots, but you ran away before I could do anything. Wow. Thank you. She ruffled my hair and pointed toward the shelters where Tae-song stood waving to catch my attention. We'll talk more when you get back. I'll keep an eye on everyone while you're gone, especially John. Tell Rachel not to worry. I gave her a quick hug and swung off the platform, savoring the realization that she'd been supporting me all along. About an hour before midnight, we reached 𝗂𝗄𝗏. Even knowing something had melted the entire valley, I still wasn't prepared for the sight. Everything organic had been reduced to a thin layer of ash that drifted past our feet, obscuring the road. Feeling exposed by the lack of vegetation, we moved in the deepest shadows, keeping watch for whatever may have caused the destruction. In town, the wind hissed around walls that had been shattered like flawed pottery in a kiln. Whatever had happened had occurred within the first days of the system, before the school's scouts went searching for survivors in the area. We crept through, trying not to disturb the tomb-like stillness. Tae-song mumbled a brief requiem when we passed the charred field where we'd played soccer against local teens. Once out of the valley, we took off our packs and hunkered down in the corner of an abandoned house to rest before continuing. Since the moon was new, Mr. Sanders was using his 45-minute group survival spell to buff himself and Rachel with Tae-song's night vision. Every time his buff expired, we rested for the 20-minute cooldown before continuing up the highway. As we continued, I could taste rain pressing in as the temperature dropped. Eventually, Rachel began to stumble as she ran, clearly suffering due to lack of sleep. We needed everyone alert since our plan depended on our ability to remain undetected by the high-level predators in the area. I jogged next to Mr. Sanders and asked where he planned to stop so Rachel could rest. "There's a place in the next valley where I often camped, but we can stop any time." He pointed up the switchbacks where the road disappeared around a curve. "Keep an eye out for a good campsite, since you can see farther than the rest of us." Before I found a suitable place, we came around a corner and discovered a gigantic serpent, its coils spilling across the highway. We ducked back, keeping the mountain between us so it couldn't use its thermal vision to sense our presence. 𝗏𝗍 swooped ahead to examine it more closely, and informed us it appeared to be digesting a large meal. It was unlikely to react to our presence so long as we did nothing to aggravate it. Group survival. Night vision would run out in a few minutes, so we followed a game trail up the side of the mountain, keeping as much earth as possible between us and the serpent. Amid the rugged terrain, I found a hollow in the mountainside. The shallow hole was just large enough for everyone to crowd inside, and we were out of time to search for better options. Gesturing for the others to stay back, I used environmental barrier to compress the thorn bushes and cacti crowding the space. I stepped to the side to release the debris outside the hollow as Mr. Sanders used a crafted plank from his inventory to scrape out a bench along the back so we could sit more comfortably. As prepared as we could be, everyone crouched beside me as Rachel cast shelter to cover the opening, muting magical signs of our presence and camouflaging our location to most forms of visual observation for the next 8 hours. The skill she'd chosen as a perk created a 2-person dome, scarcely large enough to cover the 4 of us, even with the additional space granted by the hollow. We dug out enough of the wall so Rachel could lie down with her head on her pack, but there still wasn't much room after everyone wrapped themselves in blankets. I resigned myself to ongoing discomfort, thankful that at least my new body wouldn't cramp up or resent the cold like my old one. In spite of her weariness, Rachel struggled to sleep. She claimed her air sense was reacting to the changing pressure of the incoming front, but I assumed the worry about leaving her brother behind was also keeping her on edge. Eventually, Mr. Sanders folded her into an extra tarp he'd brought, saying the additional insulation might help her relax. Either it worked, or her exhaustion finally outweighed her tension, and she fell asleep. The 𝗂𝗏 arrived in full force as the others slept. Rain seeped under the dome's edge and trickled down the wall, soaking my back and sopping into the blankets. I took the chance to absorb minerals from the muddy water as Tae-song dozed against my shoulder. Earlier, we'd agreed he should sit on my lap so the other 2 could have a little more space. Mr. Sanders didn't even seem to notice, which I hadn't expected given the school's many rules on physical contact.
I'd even gotten in trouble for sitting back to back with a friend earlier in the school year. Maybe some teachers weren't as locked into the mission's rules as I'd always assumed. As we waited for the others to awaken, 𝗬𝒍 and I reviewed our route, trying to get a sense of how much farther we'd have to travel to reach the shop. She extracted the location name of 𝗬𝒑𝒻𝒄 from the system, but it was unfamiliar to me and didn't show on the paper map we'd brought with us. I finally gave up on the pointless discussion since we didn't have enough information to plan. 𝗬𝒍 floated off to watch for predators and read up on human history, while I activated meditation in hope of postponing the impending 22 hours of sleep my body would soon demand. When the other three woke up as the shelter collapsed around dawn, I learned none of them were familiar with 𝗬𝒑𝒻𝒄 either. We'd just have to keep heading in the direction 𝗬𝒍's senses indicated, or at least follow the highway's zigzag climb to that point. After warming ourselves with steaming cups of coffee from a large thermos, we broke camp. We ended up scrambling over the mountain through thorn bushes and along slippery game trails while the rain continued to fall. Even after an hour of careful climbing, Mr. Sanders still had to use group survival with subversive stealth so we could sneak past the final stretch of the Serpent's Tail, where it curved along the highway. The steep slopes above had threatened to crumble beneath our feet, and a landslide would definitely betray our presence if the fall didn't kill us first. I looked back at the Serpent just before we rounded a corner toward a new branch of the valley. "Reminds me of our first day," I said to 𝗬𝒍. She laughed.
At least we're not inside this one.
I winced at the reminder.
It feels more like a nightmare I had once than a real experience. Logically, I should have been panicking instead of wondering why I got a stupid title. Is this indifference a polymorph thing, or am I just broken? It's a racial trait, part of your non-standard mental makeup that allows you to recover from traumatic experiences without psychological side effects.
She brushed her head against my cheek.
Pain and physical damage don't affect your kind quite so directly either, which is why you are able to keep moving even after predators take a few bites out of you. When you get a chance, you'll have to purchase the history of your people to learn more about yourself.
My people? I nearly tripped over my own feet at the thought, and Tae-song gripped my shoulder to steady me.
I'm an imposter at best, 𝗬𝒍.
She took off to float above and sent a dramatic sigh.
Not everyone is born into their true family, Adrian. Some families are chosen.
Well, it doesn't much matter if I chose them, does it? What matters is whether they choose me. She dropped the subject, instead directing my attention to the fact that, with the mountain between us, we were finally beyond even the most extended possible sensory range of the Serpent.
You can start running again, while I keep an eye out for danger from above.
We made good time between breaks, at times hiding under shelter while waiting to reactivate subversive stealth so we could sneak our way past increasingly higher-level predators. Late that afternoon, we reached a pass. Our map showed that a massive park curved up the back of an open ridge where the highway crossed to the next mountain. 𝗬𝒍 warned us the area was at least level 100 and connected to the zone I'd barely survived when the system arrived. The ridge between the mountains was scarcely the length of a soccer field, but we couldn't even see the cliffs on the far side through the heavy fog. In spite of feeling that nothing could possibly see us, we followed 𝗬𝒍's instructions and crept forward with extreme caution once the mountain no longer stood between us and the park.
Shelter, now!
At 𝗬𝒍's warning, I waved a hand in front of the group and dropped it toward the ground. We dropped and huddled together as Rachel cast shelter. 𝗬𝒍 hovered beside me as she explained.
My scans picked up on something flying toward us, but it's not within my current knowledge base, so I can't say what it is or how powerful. It's from the park side, so it's better to assume you've been detected, since the shared version of your stealth is much weaker.
Due to the need for silence, I was unable to tell the others and settled for pointing toward the sky and flapping my hands like wings. They nodded and pressed lower into the mud and grass. We only had a half hour left of stealth remaining as something spiraled above us. At one point, it flew so close that the air from its passing gusted beneath the edge of shelter. I'd almost given up on living when 𝗬𝒍's sense of its presence began to fade into the distance. Even then, I waited to signal it was gone until we had to move or risk still being in the open when group survival inevitably dropped. We crawled beside the road in the mud until long after we had crossed behind the mountain again. Late that night, We decided to rest in a dusty, undisturbed farmhouse built against a cliff near the road. Whoever had owned the place must have abandoned it or died in their fields when the system arrived. Unable to trust the adobe walls and straw roof to block system-enhanced senses, we once again crowded into the least exposed corner beneath shelter. Thankfully, there was a musty straw mattress we dragged off its rickety iron frame, and a few heavy wool blankets so the others wouldn't have to use their soaking wet coverings from the previous night. I hung our own blankets to dry over the empty bed frame. Even with their ever-increasing stats, I noticed the others were suffering from the constant cold and damp. They huddled in their blanket cocoons and clutched mugs of lukewarm coffee, wistfully agreeing that building a fire was too great a risk as they sipped the liquid. My own body seemed to adjust naturally to the ambient temperature, though I had yet to test myself against true extremes. I felt none of their discomfort. 𝗬𝗍 popped into visibility in the center of our huddle.
It looks like we're about 2/3 of the way there.
Mr. Sanders nodded. We survived the worst of it. From what we know, the next valley won't be quite so high level. For now, let's rest and regain our strength. Silence is safer. Everyone nodded, and 𝗂𝗉 settled against my side, tugging the edge of his blanket to cover me as well. I almost protested, then realized this was another moment like sharing the bread, where accepting would reassure him. I gave in and waited till he fell asleep before tucking the blanket more securely around him. Over the previous weeks, I'd begun to realize that even frequent evidence of my physical differences wasn't always enough for my friends to remember I was no longer human. 𝗬𝗍 suggested I should remember the thought whenever I felt like depressing myself by believing I was too alien for anyone to tolerate being around me. Her words followed me into the stillness as I activated meditation. We spent the next morning climbing around landslides and hiding whenever any of us sensed danger nearby. Around noon, I fell into a daze, following the others without much thought.
Adrian?
At first I couldn't focus on 𝗬𝗍's voice, but her tone sharpened.
Adrian, wake up!
I snapped alert and found everyone had stopped and crowded around me. What's wrong? Are you hurt? Mr. Sanders studied me with a concerned expression. I shivered when I realized how dangerous it was to push myself. I couldn't put off hibernation much longer, even if we had to find a location to camp before we found the shop. Seeing how I was struggling to frame my thoughts into words, 𝗬𝗍 manifested and explained the situation. Ah, 𝗂𝗉 shook his head. It's one thing to know you hibernate once a week, and another to actually see you staggering along like I do after only 16 hours. I'm so used to you being alert, no matter the time, that I forgot you'd need sleep soon. I've been using meditate at night, hoping it would help me stay awake longer. I shook my head, trying to think how to explain. My body just won't sleep. Then suddenly it's the only thing I can do. I can push myself for the rest of the day, I think, but I can't put it off much longer. I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have come. Rachel laughed in my face. If you think we'd have survived this long without you, think again. Subversive stealth is the reason we've made it this far. Everyone nodded. And group survival, shelter, night vision, I added. Based on their expressions, it obviously wasn't worth the energy to argue. Janet smirked in triumph when I gave up and gestured toward the road ahead. We're so close! From what we know, I'm pretty sure the shop is in the next valley. Let's hurry! 𝗬𝗍 made her voice audible to everyone. That's actually the reason I wanted to catch your attention. There's a system-built town ahead, and you'll find the highway has been upgraded once we reach the valley. We need to be cautious. Not all cultures play nice with humans. Let's hope they're friendly, but it's something to discuss later. We need to find a secure location first. Mr. Sanders gestured, indicating our vulnerable position. We refocused on the task of sneaking forward. 𝗂𝗉 took charge of me as we continued on our way, checking in regularly to make sure I was still functional. We had found the borders of the alien-owned land and were under shelter, attempting to gather more information when 𝗬𝗍 noticed a band of warriors hunting in our vicinity. They're of the 𝗬𝗍𝗄, which is one of the safest of the great family conglomerations we could have run into. Their motto translates to something like,
Nurturing the soil is the best way to guarantee a repeat harvest.
We had finally decided to walk openly along the highway when 𝗬𝗍 suddenly became visible.
Run! There's something beneath you!
I hurried to follow the others, only to find that a root had twined around my ankle while we had been talking. In the time it took to untangle myself, the creature at the other end realized it had located something edible. It fully broke stealth to snatch me as the others shouted a warning. Normally, I'd have activated Speed Boost immediately and easily avoided its grasp, but my reactions were slowed by exhaustion. Intervening objects shattered against my torso as it yanked me toward the center of its trap. I felt a tearing sensation as hibernation activated, erasing the world around me. 𝗍𝗐𝗐. I awoke submerged in a bitter nutrient bath with a metallic aftertaste that was somehow still the most satisfying and easily absorbable substance I'd encountered so far. Hibernation complete. Your next hibernation will begin in 146 hours. Warning. Mass now 75% below optimal range. 90% debuff to health and stamina. 𝗬𝗍 sent me a quick mental brush of relief, then reassured me everyone was safe. I was now under the care of the 𝗍𝗐𝗐𝗍, though all they could do was provide nutrients so I could rebuild mass at this point. Our group's assigned liaison, 𝗍𝒐𝗍, would lead me to our group once I had healed enough to emerge. I raised my absorption rate to the maximum and drained the last of the nutrients from the fluid. Most of my body was missing when I scanned myself. I'd never lost this much mass before. Maybe I could try morphing and end up with a miniature body, though. 𝗬𝗍 interrupted my thought process.
Please don't try to morph until you reach at least 75% mass. You have a basic, functional body at this size, but the health and stamina reductions means you'll die if someone steps on you. They're adjusting the monitor to adapt to your new absorption levels.
I resigned myself to the wait. Even with system-assisted healing to support the natural processes of regrowing my body, it would take hours to rebuild enough mass to restore my usual size. The fresh surge of nutrients swirled around me. I settled in, requesting an update on what happened while I had been out. It turned out the creature had ripped me apart. Taesong managed to cut off the tendrils that had grabbed me, but by then we were at the center of the trap, and he couldn't both fight off the monster's roots and carry me to safety. Rachel's Eye of the Storm had shielded us just long enough for the 𝗍𝗐𝗍 hunting party to arrive and cut the core of the subterranean plant elemental out of its cave. They then rushed me to the clinic, looked up polymorphs in their data, and submerged me in nutrient fluid so my body could rebuild itself while I was in hibernation. 𝗬𝗍 had been checking in on everyone while I was unconscious. Apparently, the family were excellent hosts. They had offered our party a suite in their welcome center, where my friends were now recovering from the journey. However, they had yet to permit anyone to enter the shop, explaining that they preferred to negotiate access for everyone at once. 𝗬𝗍 scoffed at their explanation.
They're studying us. Don't take what they offer at face value, Adrian, whether high or low. The 𝗍𝗐𝗍𝒂 are known for always testing for wisdom, skills, and intelligence. They don't consider it cheating when someone willingly accepts an agreement that is less than ideal.
Since the tank was completely opaque, I could only lie there in the dark. I spent the time reviewing records of the attack and figuring out how I could have done better. 𝗬𝗍 regularly left to update everyone on my condition while I tried to be patient. You have reached 80% of optimal mass. Warning. You have reached your absorption limit. Ingesting additional material will no longer improve your health and stamina due to overloading the ratio of fully established tissue to partially transformed matter. 50% debuff to toxin resistance due to 50% non-integrated matter. Complete integration will take 12 hours. Apparently speeding through rebuilding my body had limits. I was still 20% too low, but I'd have to regain the rest later. Purge ensured there was no residual poison in my channels. Morphic disguise restored my human form as 𝗬𝗍 left to alert 𝗍𝒐𝗍. It took several long minutes before the top of my temporary coffin finally flipped open. I sat up, ready to meet my first sentient alien. They look like a living 𝗔𝗍 statue. Thankfully, I managed to control my excitement enough to merely send the thoughts to 𝗬𝗍. I'd spent days reading articles on the 𝗔𝗍 a few years before. and the idea of the mystical monk who had become a protector of children had stuck with me. 𝗏𝒍 swept forward, prepared to hand me a robe as I climbed out of the tank. They paused when they noticed my faux clothing and tossed the fabric into a nearby alcove. My reduced height meant I stood face to face with them. They had a calm, rounded face and a bald head with skin the color of limestone. Their monk-like robes, drooping eyelids, and large ears only reinforced my first impression. I grinned. "Thank you for taking such good care of me." They replied in surprisingly fluent English.
"We offer healing to anyone who reaches our land after surviving the high-level zone surrounding us."
They gestured toward the arched door.
"I am 𝗏𝒍. I will lead you to your friends. They are eager to see you again."
"I'm Adrian. Thank you. I can't wait to see them too." I glanced around the room, disappointed by the lack of visible technology. Narrow, curving lines of what appeared to be glowing stone were embedded into the upper walls, illuminating the space with a soft silver light. The rounded room contained several arched alcoves with raised platforms made up with beds, though only the one behind me contained a tank. There was an extra mattress, pillow, and blanket folded on a raised shelf, also inset into a wall. 𝗏𝒍 pointed her beak at where 𝗏𝒍 waited by the door, and I realized I'd gotten too caught up in my observations.
"Sorry, I've never seen a room like this. It's very cozy."
After a brief nod, 𝗏𝒍 turned to lead the way down a long hallway. I tried not to slow down as I continued to stare at everything we passed. These people seemed to avoid sharp corners or straight lines. Every surface was arched and curved. Even the floor sloped upward. If the hallways hadn't been designed to accommodate extremely large individuals, it would have been easy to assume I'd awakened in a hobbit warren. The colors made me think of a painted desert since they'd coated the entire hallway with striped layers of what appeared to be clay and sandstone. We passed widely spaced, arched doors with surfaces carved in unique, stylized patterns. There were no windows. I glimpsed a few more 𝗏𝒍, similarly bald and robed in earthy tones, with no apparent indicators of gender. It felt like they were purposely ducking out of sight before we passed them. 𝗏𝒍 informed me the place was built on a rising spiral. Our seemingly unending path circled upward a few levels within a cone-shaped building. Our guide finally stopped in front of one of the doors.
"Inform your party that a casual appointment with the vizier has been scheduled now that you have awakened. Someone will come for you an hour after lunch."
"The vizier?" 𝗏𝒍 bowed slightly.
"We are honored to have a new vizier in charge of this endeavor. The development of a new dungeon world must be managed wisely, so the family sent one of their own." "Don't ask. It's considered an insult not to research this yourself."
𝗏𝒍 jumped in before I could embarrass myself.
"The class of vizier is only available to an official representative of the core family government. They must believe Earth will be very profitable. This town is only a small part of their holdings on Earth if they have a vizier in charge."
The door opened suddenly, and 𝗏𝒍 nodded in farewell before turning and walking briskly down the curving hall. "You're here!" Taesung pulled me through the entry. Beyond him, the room was filled with sunlight pouring through a large balcony window on the opposite wall. He measured me against his shoulder. "You made yourself a lot shorter this time." "I'm still missing 20% mass. It turns out it can be unhealthy if I rebuild too much at once." I smiled as he pulled me toward Rachel and Mr. Sanders, who were standing in the center of a sofa shaped like a concave donut with a slice taken out of it. It formed a comfortable window seat, piled with extra cushions. "Hey guys, miss me?" Rachel shook her head. "I'm glad you're alive. I don't think a human would have survived that, not even with our levels and fast healing." I moved to the open section of the sofa across from Mr. Sanders. "Hibernation shuts down my system, which stabilized me. Then the 𝗏𝒍 put me in a nutrient bath so my body could initiate repairs while I was unconscious. I wouldn't have survived without that kind of support." "We'll have to learn how to create a nutrient bath for you, but that's for later." Mr. Sanders ruffled my hair before I could dodge him. Then he settled back where he'd been sitting before I arrived. "It's good to see you, Adrian." Sumé draped herself over my chest as I sank into the surprisingly soft surface of the sofa before responding.
I'm glad you're okay too. I thought we were all done for and it was all my fault.
Rachel shook her finger at me.
I don't think getting caught by an underground monster is something to blame yourself for. It was so sneaky that Sumé only detected it after its tendrils broke the surface beneath us.
Tae-song settled next to me.
We can talk about it later. For now, they said they'd meet with us once you woke up, and we need to decide our negotiation strategy. Oh, that reminds me.
I tried to sit up straight, but the cushions gave way under me.
This thing is going to eat me.
I gave up and tucked my legs under myself for better leverage as the others laughed at my awkward flailing. When they finally settled, I returned to my interrupted thought.
𝑹𝒆𝒃𝒆𝒍 told me the vizier would meet with us after you eat lunch.
Good to know. Mr. Sanders leaned forward. You'll have to speak for Sumé since she can't maintain audio long enough to explain what we need to know. I sighed, resigning myself to playing parrot as Sumé gave a summary of the 𝗏𝗄𝗍𝒂 culture.
In the end, they're only dangerous if we start it. They destroy those who attack or cheat them. If we're useful as a business connection, client, or employee, they'll take good care of us. The worst that will happen is being sent home. Even then, they'll more than likely allow us to use the shop since we have items of value to trade.
Rachel settled back against the cushions.
They've taken good care of us since they told us we would be their guests until Adrian recovered. This suite is as comfortable as a 4-star hotel, though you never know. Maybe it's just the basics for them. I get the feeling everyone we meet is waiting for this vizier of theirs to decide our status.
Something chirped near the door. Tae-song extracted himself from the couch and retrieved 3 covered trays from a compartment in the wall. Rachel accepted her tray and crossed her legs as she tried to find a comfortable position to eat.
What I can't understand is why there are no tables. No kitchen either. Just the food delivery cabinet and these trays. I've been eating sitting on the floor since the sofa is too awkward.
Sumé hovered over my head and spoke audibly so everyone could hear.
If you're wondering how the 𝗏𝗄𝗍𝒂 manage, try reclining and eating like the Romans of your history. The trays rest in front of you and you prop yourself up with cushions.
Everyone shifted position to try her suggestion. Mr. Sanders raised an eyebrow. I suppose this explains why our meals have consisted of foods that are easy to pick up and eat. As we continued to discuss the 𝗏𝗄𝗍𝒂, the others eagerly consumed an assortment of finger foods. Most were unfamiliar, though I recognized the small empanadas. I wondered if they were trying local recipes or if the 𝗏𝗄𝗍𝒂 happened to have a similar pastry in their culture. The others finished eating and brushed their crumbs onto the trays. While setting them back inside the compartment, Tae-song found 4 sets of robes with a note explaining they were appropriate attire for the occasion. Sumé translated.
You're wearing rags, so let's get you cleaned up enough to be seen in public.
Everyone chuckled awkwardly when I shared that comment, then hurried to get changed. There was a yellow robe in the pile, perfect for my new size. I flung it on over my faux clothing, trying to get the hang of how to wrap the brown fabric belt. Sumé ended up having to coach all of us through the belt wrap, since it wasn't as simple as it appeared. We settled in to talk until a chime sounded at the door. Mr. Sanders opened it. Is everyone ready? We hurried to join 𝗏𝒆𝒃𝒆𝒍, who offered a brief bow before turning to lead the way. Our long-awaited meeting ended up feeling rather anticlimactic. The vizier was seated on a raised stool and wearing elaborate gold-fringed robes. A large round table at about counter height stood in front of him, and to either side were guards in decorative armor. 𝗏𝒆𝒃 stopped halfway to the table and formally bowed toward the vizier, then turned and gestured for us to approach.
The vizier welcomes you. No need to be formal. Stand on this side of the table and we'll discuss your situation.
It was difficult not to feel a need for formality even in this supposedly casual setting. Sumé made a quick suggestion, and I stopped before approaching the table and bowed as formally as I could without having practiced the gesture. The others caught on quickly and bowed as well.
Greetings, Vizier. We are grateful for your hospitality. I'm sure you are very busy, so thank you for meeting with us in person.
I parroted Sumé's words, since I'd gotten stuck on worrying whether I'd bowed correctly. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately as the vizier examined me with a keen interest that seemed out of place on their otherwise cherubic face. A memory of rows of smiling stone statues decorated with baby garments popped into my head. I had to fight back the urge to laugh. 𝗏𝒐𝒍 smiled slightly and gestured for us to move toward the far side of the table as they stepped to stand halfway between the two groups.
Now, please allow us to become acquainted with you. Who are you, and why have you come?
Mr. Sanders briefly introduced each of us before explaining that we represented the remaining survivors from the school. He mentioned how we had brought what we'd hoped were the best drops from the monsters we'd fought, and that we had sneaked through even higher-level zones in hope of finding a shop so we could attempt to expand our safe zone and resupply. 𝗬𝗍 pointed out that the vizier seemed especially interested at the mention of the fort, and the fact that we were a boarding school before the system had arrived, even though they remained silent. Instead, 𝗏𝒏 was the one to ask,
How many of the children survived?
Even the vizier bowed slightly in their seat on hearing that fewer than 40 students of the original 109 had survived. I had grown numb to the grief most of the time, but their acknowledgement of our losses made them feel overwhelming once again. I shivered as the memories rushed over me. Taesong's shoulder pressed lightly against mine in a quiet gesture of support. After requesting more details, 𝗏𝒏 turned toward the vizier, as if awaiting a decision. 𝗬𝗍 noted a quick hand signal, though for all we knew, they were having a lively telepathic conversation. Finally, they turned to look at Mr. Sanders once again.
You may officially make your requests, brave ones. Excellent!
𝗬𝗍 fluttered her wings in excitement.
They only offer informal titles to those who impress them in some way.
Mr. Sanders bowed his head. We merely hope for access to the shop, Vizier. We appreciate your willingness to accept strangers as guests. Also, we thank you for ensuring Adrian's survival.
Access to the shop is granted.
𝗏𝒏's eyes flickered toward the vizier for a moment before giving a brief nod.
We would reward you further. Do not accept immediately, since the process will be distracting.
They waved a hand and a notification popped up. Hidden quest complete. You have managed to impress the vizier with your behavior and your story of survival against all odds. You are now listed as Level 1 commercial partners of the 𝗏𝗍𝗂 family. As a reward, you have received the basic 𝗏𝗍𝗂 Business Information Pack, which will be installed on confirmation of your acceptance. This skill pack contains the basic trade language, basic agreements, legalities, and terminology, and the basics of social conduct. You may also request information on employment opportunities and other services from the family representative assigned to you. 𝗬𝗍 fluttered urgently on my shoulder as I finished reading.
Pay attention!
Suddenly, I realized the entire group, including the vizier, was now looking at me. This time, the vizier themselves spoke.
Greetings, rebel within. We are honored by your visit.
I jumped and stared at them at the mention of my title, having forgotten it might be important. After an admonitory peck from 𝗬𝗍, I managed to bow and parrot a reply.
Greetings, Vizier. The honor is mine. I am grateful for your assistance, or I would not have survived to be here.
I could feel my friends' eyes on my back, and wondered whether they'd be upset that I kept my title a secret from them.
Someone will meet you within the shop to discuss an opportunity with you, rebel within. You have interested us greatly. May our connection be profitable.
The vizier rose to their feet. We all bowed with 𝗏𝒏 as the vizier left with their guards. 𝗏𝒏 led us back to our door and held up a hand before we could enter.
Preparations must be made. I will return to guide you to the shop in an hour. Your suite will remain available until you are prepared to return to your fort. If you are willing to wait, we will soon send a party down the highway to assess the value of our territory near there. You may travel home with them if you wish.
I wondered why they always sent a guide as we entered the room.
We are not yet trusted enough to wander unsupervised.
𝗬𝗍 swooped over my head and became visible, making Rachel jump in surprise.
This is a very good beginning. The information packet they gave you will be useful even outside the family.
𝗬𝗍 suggested we sit before confirming acceptance of the skill pack. Apparently, we wouldn't merely be studying the information, but actually downloading knowledge into our minds. I settled into the sofa and accepted the reward. My head felt the same way as it had after I'd studied all night with only a flashlight, so I closed my eyes, hoping the sensation wouldn't last too long. I blinked slowly when the rush of information settled and the odd sensation receded. I instinctively checked the formalities of meeting the vizier and shuddered. 𝗬𝗍's prompts to bow had allowed us to pass the lowest possible bar of civility. Thankfully, the 𝗍𝗄𝗍𝗂 seemed to understand the obstacles to intercultural communication and hadn't taken offense at our lapses. It also appeared that the vizier wouldn't have bothered meeting with us themselves had it not been for my title. I winced at the memory of receiving the ironic notification that I was now titled Rebel Within, as I had sat in a tunnel deep underground. Surrounded by the decomposing remains of the creature that had eaten me whole, it had felt like salt on my wounds. I had done my best to ignore the notification, in spite of 𝗬𝗍's congratulations. Mr. Sanders had finished absorbing his skills as well, and now sat studying me. He leaned forward and rested his chin on his hands when I met his eyes.
Just so you know, I've been aware of the title since you returned. My insight skill allows me to see these details. However, you've been through a lot, so I didn't ask about it. May I ask now? How did you get a title?
The others turned to stare at me expectantly, and I sighed. I was only level 2 at the time, and still trying to escape the national park beyond the mountain where I decided to camp out until the school stopped looking for me. The rainforest had become a level 100 zone. Anyway, a tunneling monster with a head like a shark and the body of a snake easily swallowed me in a single gulp. I was still too low level and inexperienced to hide properly. Rachel gasped. How could anyone survive that? I can still breathe when immersed in fluids, and I'm immune to toxins, including digestive enzymes, as long as I'm alive. I hesitated. Still, I'm not entirely certain myself. The details of the experience have gone foggy. Apparently, the polymorph race instinctively protects its sanity by reducing access to memories of traumatic experiences. 𝗬𝗍 tells me that I managed to use the creature's own enzymes against it by clawing through the lining of the throat and using a blood thinner toxin I'd picked up earlier to prevent it from healing itself. I still don't fully understand how I managed to not only survive, but kill the creature. Apparently, the system found the unexpected success of my frantic attempts to escape worth noting, and voila, a title.
Taesong patted my knee.
Well, I'm glad you survived, Rebel Within, he grinned. I like it. Worming my way deeper into the sofa, I considered hiding behind a cushion. Being called a rebel had always been a precursor to punishment, both with my parents and at school. I had hoped nobody would ever find out, even though System thought I was one. Being a rebel was a terrible flaw, not a cool title or something I wanted for a nickname. Mr. Sanders sighed at my reaction.
I know the mission tends to be harsh when it comes to those who think for themselves, Adrian. Keep in mind that you were dealing with a kind of system back then, too. The school just wasn't willing to blatantly explain its biases, definitions, and influences at every turn the way the current system does.
He slipped smoothly into lecture mode.
Some people follow systems and rules because it's easier to just do what an authority tells you to do than it is to truly process a situation. It takes time and effort to research the influences that create context and affect others' choices. As a result, the label of a rebel had been applied to thousands throughout history. It is only later that many of those stories of rebellion were revisited and reinterpreted. We frequently call them heroes, but that's not how they were seen by those who didn't appreciate the way they exposed the flaws in their societies. Even the Bible was primarily written by rebels.
𝗬𝗍 became visible long enough to offer Mr. Sanders a vibrant, "Thank you! Adrian needed to receive this lecture from a teacher."
Mr. Sanders coughed. I apologize for dropping into lecture mode. I simply hope you won't be too hard on yourself, Adrian.
I managed to endure the resulting awkwardness until Janet took pity on me and diverted everyone toward another topic. After closing my eyes, I pressed my face into a cushion and tried to think. I wasn't certain what to do with the thought that being a rebel might be a good thing. It felt like I accidentally dug my way out of a cave system I'd been buried in my entire life, and found myself standing in the center of a vast plain, exposed, directionless, intimidated, and, for the first time, free? The door chimed, and Mr. Sanders hurried to greet 𝗏𝒐𝒐𝒏 as I opened my eyes. It seemed everyone had heard the news that we were now considered more than mere savages. A bustling crowd of 𝗏𝒂𝒄𝒏 and other aliens moved through the hallways. One even looked similar to the diva 𝗏𝒆𝒃𝒆𝒍 in Fifth Element. Because we were finally on our way to the shop, I tried not to get too distracted by the fact that I could now understand the casual conversations of people around us. Even so, it was obvious I was missing a lot of nuance. The information packet was apparently the very basics. I already knew I wanted more. Negotiations. After touching an orb, we found ourselves suddenly standing in a shop that matched the building we'd been visiting in shape, decoration, and colors. The only new element was a small, raised garden with a fountain and an alcove along the wall. 𝗏𝒐𝒿, now able to remain visible somehow, offered to take charge of haggling for better prices on our loot. It was the first time I'd seen an enthusiastic 𝗏𝒂𝒄𝒏. The shopkeeper gesticulated wildly as 𝗏𝒐𝒿 countered their initial offers. She soon called me over to telepathically explain every transaction in detail. I tried to notice the clues that would help me know when someone was testing to see whether I was a worthy trading partner. The others retreated to a smaller variation on the circular sofa to explore possible purchases as they waited. We finally cleared even Mr. Sanders' massive extra inventory of its last item. By that point, I managed to raise my new trade skills by 3 levels, and my respect for my companion even further. Altogether, we earned enough credits to purchase the central plaza of the school and the 4 buildings surrounding it. This was only possible after a 50% discount for previous occupancy, combined with Mr. Sanders' 10% off for being a school administrator. At least we could now move into 2 of the smaller dorms. Our dining room and kitchens were also inside the safe zone, along with several classrooms that could be repurposed into residences. With the remaining credits, Mr. Sanders dove into choosing additional purchases and comparing the cost of building upgrades. His skills were customized around managing supplies for the school, so he was in his element. He'd already delegated a couple thousand credits to each of our fighters, including those back at the school. He explained that it would benefit the community for us to invest in ourselves, and that, in the future, he would insist on splitting the profits. Everyone would also receive notifications and know we had reached a shop. My inventory had long been crammed full of rare loot from my initial struggle to rejoin my friends. I hadn't trusted anyone to remember the income wasn't a community resource, since everyone else had donated their loot to the school. Now that it was my turn to sell, I hesitated. What if I earned enough for another building? Would everyone understand if I chose to spend my income on a spell to block Watson's influence and expose him? Rachel and Tae-song were both immersed in figuring out what they'd buy with the credits Mr. Sanders had given them, and I felt relieved that they wouldn't be watching. This time, 𝗏𝒐𝒿 had me take the lead and only offered suggestions. In the end, I earned a tidy sum of 40,000 credits. It only took a moment to switch to purchasing once we were through. 𝗏𝒐𝒿 swiftly sorted our options by what we knew of Watson's skills.
We need something that prevents or counters both charisma influences and spells that affect the mind.
She flicked 3 choices in my direction as the 𝗏𝒂𝒄𝒏 in charge of the shop now stood back and observed with calm detachment. Here, prices were fixed by the system and non-negotiable.
The first 2 are lower impact, but what we can afford. Neither spell is guaranteed to be completely effective, but they might work. And at the very least, everyone will be slightly less affected by his buffs and spells while the spell is active.
𝗏𝒐𝒿 pointed her beak toward the final option.
If you can persuade anyone else to contribute, this would definitely prevent him from manipulating everyone long enough to figure out how to handle him. As a bonus, It would also block certain skills and spells during battle.
Advanced Con Containment, a vital skill for law enforcement. Prevents the target from using charisma and mental influence skills and spells for up to 5 hours. After reading the description, I turned toward Mr. Sanders and realized he'd already been listening in on our discussion.
I can't contribute, I'm sorry. He shook his head. There is too much needed to ensure basic survival for everyone right now. Righting the terrible injustice that has been done to you is something we are capable of resolving, even without spells. It will just take longer for everyone to understand the need for action. I promise I won't give up until we find a way to ensure they deal with Watson.
I sighed.
It's all right. I already knew it would be too much to ask.
Even the full amounts both Rachel and Taesong had received wouldn't be enough to make up the difference. I glared at the remaining options, trying to resign myself to spending all my credits on something that wouldn't solve our problem. There was nobody left to arrest the man or try him, but I wished I could find some reliable authority outside Watson's mental influence. It would be best if I didn't have to kill him to protect everyone. Sumei flicked a wing toward Vaone, and I realized they'd been waiting for me to glance in their direction. They directed me through a door that had appeared in the far wall.
The meeting the vizier mentioned has been arranged.
Once again, the decor was very similar, and I wondered whether it was a signature look for the sake of marketing or a cultural design based on the Beoheva planet of origin. This time, however, the room was empty aside from a table full of refreshments in the center of a traditional rounded sofa. An array of tiny cups sparkled with a variety of liquids in all colors. Vaone directed me to sit, but remained standing outside the sofa's circle.
You will meet the individual of whom the vizier spoke. We await their arrival.
A few minutes later, a flamboyantly dressed Beoheva burst into the room, clearly scandalizing Vaone. Vaone stiffened at the sight. Their iridescent robes gaped open in a way that the basics of social conduct proclaimed would be insulting to anyone other than the most intimate of friends. I stood and bowed, admiring the brightly colored fan of feathers and flowers bouncing precariously on their head. Whatever had I gotten myself into? It seemed interesting. They turned to face me and proclaimed in English, "I am genius." Even Sumei was unable to discern whether this was, in fact, their name or a self-description. They noticed my confusion and clarified, "You may call me genius. This human term suits me." They languidly reclined on the sofa and gestured grandly at the table. "I have arranged for refreshments that should appeal to you, my dear rebel within. While you savor them, listen and consider my offer." They claimed one of the cups and tilted their head as they waited for me to do the same. I took a cup filled with a pale blue liquid with bubbles and sipped cautiously. The flavor was much clearer and sharper than anything I'd sampled before. "It's very good." "Of course. It is the fermented juice of a rare blueberry variety that only grows near mountain mineral springs. It is both nutritious and delicious." Nobody would ever claim that randomly absorbing bushes and cacti that happen to cross your path develops a refined palate, Adrian. Sumei preened her wings. "Of course this tastes better." "Good point. I haven't had the chance to experience tastier fluids." I finished the juice and set the empty cup on the table. "Excellent." They nodded, obviously waiting for me to claim another cup before explaining the reason for our meeting. "I am an entertainment producer." They paused dramatically. "Of course, and a stereotypical drama queen as well." I wondered why Sumei sounded offended, until she allowed me to view the constant barrage of notifications that said I had resisted mental influences. "Okay, I'll be careful. Now, shh, let me listen." This flamboyant individual personified the boldness I'd often wished to have. They summarized a flattering description of a brave adventurer surviving against all odds. I only recognized this hero as myself because they had directly explained they were talking about me. The fruit juices were much easier to absorb than the myth genius was spinning. The flavors filled a hunger I hadn't even realized existed. I continued to sip slowly, savoring each drop as they continued to expand on the concept. It became clear they were laying out the framework for some kind of play or movie based on an extremely skewed interpretation of the events leading to receiving my title. 𝗬𝗍 mentioned they had probably purchased a summary of my experience from the system, since they knew details even I hadn't known. Eventually, Genius finished circling and came to their point, sitting up and taking on a recognizably formal posture. "And so we wish to purchase your story for 50,000 credits. The amount was enough to stun me into silence. I could expose Watson and still help purchase supplies. Think, Adrian. The first offer is a test. 𝗬𝗍 didn't seem inclined to speak out loud, leaving me to figure out how to react. Can you explain the process? You already seem to have access to everything that happened, so I'm wondering what the payment is for. I was pretty sure I sounded like an idiot. Genius gestured as though flinging an invisible ball. Here is the contract. A box popped up in front of me, and they sipped a golden juice I hadn't tried yet. 𝗬𝗍 read the details through alongside me. They're asking you to give them your own memory files, you know? You're going to be visible to a lot of people if you do this. You dislike your title, and they've made it the central feature of their marketing plan. Your race change might also bring up social elements you haven't considered. This is an established company with a big name, so the amount they're offering seems low given the exposure you'll be facing. I'm still not sure why they're even asking you in the first place. They have all the power here, and it makes me nervous. While the thought made me wince, the credits were a huge lure. At the same time, I didn't want to pull anyone else into the consequences of my choices. By the time we reached an agreement that protected the school and my friends from exposure, I felt like I'd been pulled through a wringer. 𝗬𝗍 continued to suggest I should hold out for a higher amount, but Genius had already tripled their offer. I couldn't help but feel like I'd won the lottery in spite of her warnings. I'd received enough credits to ensure I could counter Watson's manipulation, and that was all I cared about. An overly dramatic presentation of my struggle to survive and make my way back to safety when the system had arrived would have very little effect on my life. After all, I lived in the isolated wildlands of Earth, as a Genius had phrased it. There was nothing important about me, and I worried they might not even make back the credits they were paying. 𝗬𝗍 begged me one last time to at least request a day to think it over or demand legal counsel before signing. But I knew I'd hate myself if they changed their mind. The ability to block Watson's power was on the line. After a formal exchange, a new notification glowed in front of me, showing an incredible increase in my personal fortune. I had to work hard to focus and bow formally to conclude the meeting instead of jumping for joy. Having accomplished their goal, Genius rose from the sofa and examined my face, this time without the overt drama. You have potential as a negotiator, so I will give free advice. It is in your best interests to require the attendance of your own legal advisor before you agree to contracts instead of attempting to create your own agreements within a system you don't fully understand. They bowed slightly. Next time we meet, I expect you to be more of a challenge, my dear rebel within. I will be observing your progress. Resuming their persona, they swept out of the room. I collapsed into the sofa, simmering amid an odd mixture of triumph over my sudden windfall and worry over whether I had failed to protect myself in a way that might come back to haunt me. Finally, I put the internal debate aside and focused on my new ability to protect everyone. As I settled down, I realized 𝗐𝗐 had vanished at some point during the negotiations and had only just returned. They nodded formally. Do you wish to continue shopping? Your companions have completed their transactions and returned to the suite if you prefer to join them there. I returned to the main shop to make the one purchase that was most important to me, then purchased 𝗬𝗍 the upgrade she'd been wanting so she could access more detailed information and detect predators more easily. Even after paying for both, I still had credits left to help with purchasing supplies. As I followed 𝗐𝗐 back to the suite, I wondered whether the others would be upset with me for spending so much without asking their opinions. Eventually, 𝗬𝗍 grew weary of my mental flagellation.
Stop it. You're not obligated to make every decision by committee. You've earned every one of the credits you spent, and you could waste every last credit on guarana and fantasy books, and nobody would have the right to complain. Get used to being an adult, Adrian. You'll need that confidence to deal with Watson.
The others were relaxing on the sofa, immersed in their screens, as I let myself in. Outside, the sky was already dark. Taesong glanced up and gave me a relieved smile, patting the cushions beside him. They told us you were meeting with someone about that offer the vizier mentioned. How did it go? I tried to shrug off my fears and moved to sit between him and Rachel. At least he would understand my choice, even if nobody else would. Mr. Sanders' face was tense as he gestured at his screen, and he jumped when I walked in front of him.
Adrian, you're back!
Obviously, he'd been intensely focused on whatever he'd been studying. Rachel blinked back tears and looked up at me over the edge of a cushion. I hope you have good news. Please, please have good news. I don't think I could handle anything else today. Are you guys okay? Something must have happened after I left, since they hadn't been this gloomy before.
I looked up the families of everyone at the fort.
Mr. Sanders' voice faded, and he shook his head.
Not many survived.
It's only me and John left. Rachel's voice caught on a sob. I sat beside her and leaned to offer her a hug, not knowing what to say. She burst into salt-flavored tears and curled up against my shoulder. Feeling helpless, I turned to look at Taesong. My parents are still alive. He was obviously relieved, but still looked hesitant. There's no way to say this easily, but your family is dead too. I'm sorry. I blinked. I expected so. They were in the middle of an extremely high-level zone. They wouldn't have accepted the system's suggestions since it doesn't mesh with their beliefs. I could see Taesong had expected more of a reaction. His love for his parents would have made similar news as devastating to him as it had been for Rachel. You see, my parents always hated me. Maybe I should feel sad. Maybe I'm a terrible person, but...
It's okay to feel relieved when someone can no longer abuse you, Adrian.
Mr. Sanders sighed.
They caused you far too many wounds while they were alive, so it's not surprising they didn't leave much of an injury by dying.
For some reason, the fact that he understood made me wish I could still cry. Polymorphs don't have that kind of physical reaction to grief, however. I shivered at the intense rush of emotions and leaned back into the sofa as Rachel's sobs began to slow. It felt important to explain. I finally realized I'd never had parents when they didn't stand up for me against Watson. I ran away from school because it hurt so much. But now I've lost people who actually cared about me. Our friends died defending us so we can keep on living. That's what means the most to me, you know? Taesong's face dropped against my shoulder, and his tears combined with the flavor of Rachel's. Tasting their grief, I couldn't stop shivering as salt soaked into my skin. Eventually, Mr. Sanders sighed.
Let's focus on the present. Tell us about your meeting, Adrian.
I explained the meeting with Genius at length, then quickly described my purchases. I wanted to offer you the rest to help with supplies. I fell silent, waiting for Mr. Sanders' reaction. At some point during my story, Rachel had pulled away and was now wrapped around a cushion instead. Taesong seemed to be on the verge of sleep against my shoulder. Huh. Mr. Sanders examined me closely and finally shook his head.
It's ironic that your title would suddenly become so very public after hiding it for so long. You need to purchase the knowledge you'll need to deal wisely with our alien neighbors, Adrian. Make sure you are prepared to protect yourself both socially and physically. After you have what you need, then I might accept a portion of what remains to help provide for the school.
He shook his finger at me.
I won't take your word for it. Only 𝗬𝗍's will do.
𝗬𝗍 burst out laughing.
He's got you there, Adrian. No generous self-sabotage for you.
I shook my head, but Mr. Sanders interrupted before I could speak. It isn't selfish to nurture your own strength, Adrian. Those who don't understand the importance of this task usually fail in their attempts to care for others. Taesong poked me in the side. Shut up and just nod your head. His voice slurred slightly with drowsiness. If you insist on letting us spend your money, we'll just spend it on you. Now let me sleep so I'll be awake to supervise your shopping excursion tomorrow. Rachel chuckled at his words and curled up with a cushion beside me. Even Mr. Sanders merely stretched out where he had been sitting and propped his shoulders on a pile of cushions. Lights out. Surprisingly, the lights actually understood his spoken instructions, and the room went dark. None of them seemed inclined to retreat into the cozy alcoves to sleep in their own beds. I watched the stars spin outside the window. Sume, I think I might understand what you meant about choosing family. She snorted, looking up from whatever text she'd been reading.
It's about time.
She draped herself over a cushion and waved a wingtip in my direction.
You were trained to be so certain that nobody could possibly want you that you didn't even notice we had all adopted you long ago. Now, go meditate or something. I just found a hilarious theory about how the world is secretly flat, and I plan to read everything I can find on the topic.
The next morning, with everyone crowded around offering opinions on my options, I felt like I'd been dropped in the middle of a circus. You definitely need health and well-being for polymorphs, Adrian. Taesong was having far too much fun pulling up anything with the word polymorph in its name. Rachel selected the mystical secrets behind the success of the 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and pushed it into the stack of possibilities as well. I groaned at the title and eliminated it, then glanced to see whether Mr. Sanders might be willing to save me. He noticed my pleading expression, but shrugged and looked away to hide his smirk. Eventually, Sume stopped laughing at their craziness and took pity on me.
Here's what I recommend.
The massive pile shrank to a manageable level, and I sighed in relief, taking a look at the first item on the list. Polymorph Childhood Education, Life Skills and Survival Pack. A collection of skills and basic information that most polymorphs learn as children. It is useless to most, aside from freed slaves, the mind broken, feral wanderers, and others who have been deprived of their birthright. Sume refused to meet my eyes after I read the description. I couldn't argue with her logic, though. I needed to figure out how to make the best use of my new body, since I'd managed the changes mostly by using morphic disguise to make myself as human as possible. In the end, I left the shop with a stack of new skills, including intermediate 𝗏𝗏𝗏 business skills and culture, countering manipulation techniques, and basic bartering and negotiations. I was also wearing a new mana-fueled, arm-mounted variable projectile launcher as well. Sume had strongly suggested it as the most cost-effective solution to my need for some kind of weapon, along with the skills to aim accurately and craft projectiles. This way, I could restock without access to the shop. Everyone insisted I should wait and spend the pitiful remainder of my windfall on upgrades for Fort Tin or the school's new safe zone when we got home. Justice. The next day, I found myself crowded into one of the 2 armored transports assigned to the survey team. Vaone, who seemingly had been permanently assigned to our group, sat nearby. Even with survey spells slowing us every few kilometers, they claimed we'd be at the school within a few hours. Since the transport had anti-grav and didn't need to follow the many curves of the highway, we could have arrived within 15 minutes. My cramped position in the corner couldn't muffle my excitement over the first mechanically advanced technology I'd seen. Many system conveniences seemed to be fueled by ambient mana, which meant they didn't always have a space-age aesthetic. But this transport could have been lifted straight out of a Star Wars movie. Suddenly, Vaone sat up straight and spun to face us as everyone on board surged into a flurry of preparation. It seems Fort Tin has fallen under an attack. Our battle group will drop first to clear the way. I will join you to meet with the survivors and help coordinate your defenses. I jumped to my feet in a rush to run and help, then had to wait for an excruciating 10 minutes until we settled to the ground and the ramp finally lowered. I paused in shock at the blackened rubble in front of me. Tae-song and Mr. Sanders pushed me forward. The bunk shelters were smoking, I hoped because someone had followed through on the plan to use them as a firewall in an emergency. Thankfully, the main building still remained standing, and I could see rifles poking out of the shutters. 2 armored 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏 warriors stood guard near the shattered doorway, stomping on a still-twitching body of a massive 𝗦𝘆𝘀𝗍𝗵𝗄𝗏. It was even larger than the one our party had killed only 10 days before. A similar corpse lay draped over the cooking shelter, and the sounds of battle continued behind the building. Mr. Sanders hurried forward with Rachel close behind him. I could only hope John had survived. I let Tae-song guide my steps as he moved to walk beside me. Better to just face the worst and get it over with. 𝗏𝗏𝗍 followed silently, their alien presence both intrusive and reassuring. The sounds of battle grew louder as we approached the building. More warriors ran to the side, their weapons raised. I hurried to get inside, knowing I wouldn't be of any help in the attack. Tae-song began to turn, but 𝗏𝗏𝗍 caught his arm.
Our warriors have the problem handled. Your time will come. Introduce me to your people for now.
The fort was dark due to the heavily shuttered windows. In the stream of light through the doorway, I saw groups of people huddling together. Too many were missing limbs. Rachel had already found John propped up near the door and was now stroking his hair as she gazed at his missing legs in shock. Miss Janey and 2 other teachers hurried forward, with Mr. Sanders close behind. "Thank you so much for assisting us in defending the fort." Stepping forward, 𝗏𝗏𝗍 gestured for me to join the group. Tae-song had already moved to join Janet, and I reluctantly turned from my friends, wondering what I could do among the adults. 𝗏𝗏𝗍 bowed slightly to Miss Janey.
I would do more, but I will need access to do so. The family is prepared to purchase this fort from you at a reasonable price. We planned to set up a guard post in the area even before knowing there were children to protect, but now the matter has become urgent. I hoped they would accept, since we didn't have enough resources to shield the new safe zone now that we'd bought it. I'd been worried about how we would guard both areas even before the attack, and now we'd lost even more people. Miss Janey glanced at Mr. Sanders, then shook her head. It's not as though we have a hope of defending ourselves without enough credits to shore up the defenses on our new property. If we accept, will you help us clear the school safe zone so we can move soon? 𝗏𝗏𝗍 gave a firm nod. When the security and protection of children are at stake, the family is generous. We offer 100,000 credits, which is what the fort would be worth if it were not currently under siege. We govern this entire area, and the fort will be tasked with securing safety for those who live here. This includes clearing your safe zone as long as you maintain your commercial partnership with us. 𝗬𝗍 made herself visible. This is a very generous offer by any standards. Miss Janey sighed. Give us a few minutes to discuss it. If you'll wait here, we'll return shortly. The teachers picked their way across the room, discussing the offer in low voices. I turned to 𝗏𝗏𝗍. Thank you for your generous offer. Their face tightened as they looked around the room. We do not expose our children to such overwhelming dangers. Eventually, 𝗏𝗏𝗍 must have received a message because they gestured for me to follow them back outside. The area is secure for now. Soon after, the teachers joined us. This time, Watson was with them, his face tense with frustration. I took the opportunity to try con containment for the first time. My mana dropped by 400, and I wondered when he'd noticed that his abilities had been locked down for the next 5 hours. Unsurprisingly, everyone agreed to sell the fort. There were too many obvious benefits with our survival on the line, and the credits would help them upgrade defenses on the new safe zone. 𝗏𝗏𝗍 formally completed the transaction, and we watched in shock as the entire area transformed in moments. The broken walls reformed and thickened into a 2-meter-high walkway around the perimeter. A long, curved building with multiple doors took shape on one side. Above us arched a shimmering shield. Beneath our feet, the rubble melted away, replaced by what appeared to be a ceramic patio. I turned back toward the original building, which remained unaltered.
It looked dingy and out of place in contrast to the flowing design of its surroundings.
Your building will not be altered until everyone has been moved into the new barracks. Our floor plan is too different from the current layout to upgrade it safely while occupied.
𝗏𝒐𝒍 nodded before turning away.
I will be in the transport if I am needed.
I bowed formally alongside Mr. Sanders as the rest of the adults looked on. Watson's frustration had developed into a simmering rage. We barely made it through the door before Watson turned on me.
You may have saved us for now, but you have stolen our freedom in the process, you traitor! They're already taking away our abilities and planning to enslave us!
Mr. Sanders pushed between us, knocking Watson back a step.
I take it you realized you can't use your spells anymore? Did you really try to manipulate our benefactor, or were you attempting to control our choices instead?
You all agreed it is my job to ensure we remain united and organized as a team, working together to ensure our survival. Why are you suddenly questioning me as if I'm in the wrong for doing what you yourselves asked of me?
Ms. Janey stepped forward. My skills are currently working just fine, Watson, and I have seen no evidence of betrayal. We agreed to do what it takes to secure our safety. Adrian had nothing to do with this decision. What is going on with you?
With a sigh, Mr. Sanders leaned back against the wall.
I thought we'd postpone this discussion until after we take care of moving everyone over to the barracks. Still, I suppose I can summarize for now. First, Watson has been using his skills to assault our students and cover up the evidence. Second, Adrian purchased a law enforcement spell that will temporarily prevent Watson from using his skills and spells so he can't manipulate anyone. He turned toward Watson. The block on your abilities has nothing to do with the 𝗏𝒆𝒄𝒄𝗏. It's a necessary precaution. I completely support limiting your abilities until we can sit down and review the evidence 𝗓𝒍 and Adrian have gathered.
I've done nothing wrong, Watson sneered at me. I can't believe you'd accept the word of a rebellious child when you know how much I've sacrificed to help everyone.
Mr. Sanders sighed. You really don't understand, do you? There is no such thing as a secret anymore, Watson. The system records everything we do. We all have access to our own experiences. With enough credits, anyone's records can be bought. When I looked into it, even I have witnessed questionable behavior toward 𝗓𝒍, actions for which I would usually have immediately brought you before the committee. Yet, for some reason, I forgot these events occurred until I ran a specific search for them.
The expressions of the teachers varied, from Miss Angela's intense concern to Mr. Potts' firm solidarity with his longtime friend. Most just looked overwhelmed at this new complication on top of the tragedy of the attack. A heated conversation broke out, and I couldn't figure out whether they were more offended at the accusations against Watson or the fact that the system was so invasive as to record everything. As their voices began to rise, 𝗓𝒍 interrupted.
We could use some help moving to the barracks. They have bathrooms and food over there and enough beds for everyone. Besides, I think Liaison 𝗏𝒏𝒐𝒏 would appreciate upgrading this building as soon as possible so they have a place for their own people as well.
Ms. Angela immediately turned to gather the younger kids, who were the only ones who had made it through without a scratch. Her shirt was shredded and bloody on the back, though she'd already healed. As I helped move our few remaining supplies, I learned we had lost another 17 of our friends. Cher was among them. She was stung while carrying John to safety, and Joachim hadn't been able to counter the poison in time to save her. I ended up claiming the alcove next to John, and I huddled there listening as he and Rachel cried together. I found myself wordlessly shivering with grief as 𝗏𝒐𝒏 murmured comfortingly. It felt as though I'd been trapped in ice. Eventually, 𝗓𝒍 found me and pulled me out into the sunlight next to the transport. 𝗏𝒏 showed herself briefly, hovering face to face with 𝗓𝒍.
I'm leaving Adrian to you for now. I'll be back soon.
He bowed as though she were offering him a great honor.
I'll be here.
I sighed as his words mirrored the painful thought that had been drilling into me all afternoon.
If only I'd been here, I could have saved Cher.
I dropped to the ground and stared up at the cloudless sky.
You know, if only is just a dream.
𝗓𝒍 settled next to me. will help others in honor of her memory. We sat in silence for a long time as I refocused on trying to solve the problem lying ahead of us. What are we going to do about Watson? I winced at the memory of Watson's reaction to my skill. He is furious that I can shut him down with containment, and several of the adults still aren't sure who to believe. I overheard them talking, and the things my parents told them still undermine me as a witness. Since you're my friend, some are jumping to the conclusion that I've somehow corrupted you. Mr. Sanders and Miss Allison have seen enough to believe us and are on our side, but the rest are overwhelmed and confused. Taesong settled his swords across his knees. I'm not sure what they'll do, even if they do acknowledge he sexually assaulted us and abused his power to manipulate them. Kill him? Even kicking him out is equivalent to a death sentence. Imprisoning him would be a burden on the rest of us when we scarcely have enough people to protect ourselves. We're basically cut off from justice, even if they agree he did wrong.
A new voice broke in on our conversation.
Justice resides with the family of the 𝗟𝗄𝗄𝗏 and arrives with us when we claim new territories. Since you are commercial partners, I can represent you. Only keep in mind that, once we become involved, our justice is enforced by the system without exception. I spun in place, surprised to see 𝗏𝒐𝒐 standing nearby. 𝗏𝒏 is your ally in this. 𝗤𝒐 landed on my shoulder. I decided it was important for them to know the difficulties you are facing, and told them of the problem before bringing them to you in time to overhear your conversation. I nodded at 𝗏𝒏. It was too late to debate 𝗤𝒐's decision, and I had to admit I couldn't think of any other solution aside from becoming a murderer. Join me if you will, 𝗏𝒏 smiled slightly. I prefer not to sit on the ground. We scrambled to our feet and followed them into the newly remodeled central building of the fort, now a curved tri-level cone with a ramp spiraling up the exterior to a platform at the top. The second level contained a large, round room, with a stone table in the center, reminiscent of the room in which we had met the vizier. I'll call Sanders and the rest. 𝗤𝒐 didn't wait for me to agree before swooping out the door. 𝗏𝒏 examined us for a moment. First, let us discuss how best to protect the two of you from those who may not understand your choices. We wish to hire Taesong and any others who are suitable as guards to be stationed here at the fort. Adrian, your unique abilities are useful to us as well, though you will primarily be exploring our lands in search of dungeons and nests. As employees of the family, you will live in the barracks, receive a weekly income, and work alongside our mercenaries to secure the area. Your primary tasks will be to locate resources, cull predators, and guard the safe zones within our territory. Are you interested? Taesong and I glanced at each other, then nodded firmly. Yes. We'll negotiate the details later. Understand we would have made this offer even without these circumstances. However, even if these people choose not to accept our judgment regarding this, Watson, you will no longer be under their influence. 𝗏𝒏's eyes glinted with anger. Those who prefer to debate blindly rather than seeking out information that easily enables them to know the truth have not earned the right to be responsible for guarding the young.
I agree.
Mr. Sanders stepped through the door, closely followed by the rest of the teachers. Watson was looking a little too smug. I realized my skill had worn off and quickly refreshed it. Moments later, his expression shifted from arrogance to fury. Had he really assumed I would let him use his abilities in this situation?
We should deal with this later. We need to clear out the safe zone and move everyone into the dorms. This is a waste of our time.
Mr. Potts stood beside Watson as the others arrayed themselves around the table. Taesong stepped forward nervously. I know you're concerned about the monsters outside, but those are easy to recognize and to fight. I'm more worried about a monster among us. How can I protect myself and my friends when you don't take this threat seriously? 𝗏𝒏 glanced around the room. Do you accept that as liaison of the family, everything I observe of your behavior will affect my decisions?
I am the one who decides on trade privileges. I decide on the level of support and protection we offer your community. Think carefully where you stand. Sexual assault is not a crime taken lightly among the 𝗟𝗄𝗏.
When nobody objected, 𝗏𝒐𝒍 masterfully took charge of the room. They led everyone step by step through the intense questioning, clarifying the sequences of events since I had spoken up before the system had arrived. By the time he linked everyone to the records of Taesong's interactions with Watson, most of the teachers had already shuffled away from Watson's side of the table. A series of nauseatingly manipulative interactions played out in front of us. Eventually, even Mr. Potts stepped away, unable to overlook the evidence that shattered his trust in the end. For once, Watson seemed unable to find an excuse and stood silently, his eyes narrowed. One of the warriors who had arrived with the transport appeared soon after to remove Watson from the room. He exploded in fury, and the sound of his ranting trickled back through the open door.
They manufacture lies using this cursed system, and you just swallow them whole? How can you trust these demons?
His voice faded in the distance as everyone slumped wearily. Realizing that nobody was prepared to take the lead, Mr. Sanders finally hustled the teachers from the room before turning back to study Taesong and me with a shake of his head.
I'm sorry this didn't happen sooner.
I should have pushed harder when you first spoke up, Adrian. Taesong slumped against the wall beside me, seeming as emotionally drained as I felt. I hesitated a moment, fishing for the right words.
It's like you said. Everyone was trapped by the old system in the same way that we're stuck with this new system. It just wasn't as obvious. I'm just relieved there are ways to prove the truth now, and that it's finally over.
My wife and I loved being dorm parents, since we couldn't have children of our own. She would have been proud of you both, just like I am.
Mr. Sanders' voice cracked, and he patted my shoulder gently before walking into the shadows beyond the door. As he left, Taesong dropped to the floor and scrubbed his face.
I don't want to sleep in the backs tonight. I'm sure they'll soon start judging me for being gay.
𝗏𝒐𝒍 moved to the door, then turned and nodded.
We'll complete our negotiations in regard to your employment tomorrow morning. For now, rest here. I understand you find our gathering circles comfortable.
As they spoke, the table sank into the floor and a familiar sofa arrangement slid out from a wall to take its place. They stepped out and the door closed behind them. Sumé settled on my shoulder as I offered a hand to help Taesong back to his feet. We dropped into the sofa with sighs of relief.
I guess we can consider ourselves officially graduated now that we're going to work for a living.
He laughed.
I could never have imagined we'd be jumping at the chance to work as gods. At least I've got friends to face it with me.
I slumped back against the cushions and sighed.
I can't imagine it any other way.
He flopped to the side against a cushion and craned his neck to look at me.
As far as I'm concerned, we're family, you know.
I turned to rest my head on the same cushion and stretched my feet in the opposite direction.
I feel the same way. Maybe we can adopt Rachel and John, too.
He yawned.
And Mr. Sanders, I think he wishes he'd been your dad.
Maybe.
It was too much to think about just now.
Go to sleep already. We can talk about this more later.
Whatever lay ahead, I just have to do my best to prepare myself. I opened one of the books Sumé had insisted on, Inside Polymorph History and Culture. It was time to explore this new life. Maybe one of these days, I'd find the courage to show Taesong my new form. Name, Adrian. Level 21. Race, Polymorph, A. Health, 500. Mana, 520. Class, Toxic Apothecary. Title, Rebel Within. Stamina, 500. Mass, 60. 55 to 75 optimal. Strength, 31. Constitution, 55, -5. Intelligence, 52. Charisma, 15. Agility, 32. Perception, 25. Willpower, 36. Luck, 15. Skill, subversive stealth skill. Hide from localized system scans, spells, skills, and senses. Chameleon skin skill. Superficial skin alterations to merge into the environment. Danger sense skill. Warning of immediate danger and direction of origin. Improved chance to see through stealth. Speed boost skill. Temporarily increases speed. Morphic disguise spell. Design and save one full body design per 10 levels. -5 to Constitution while in any disguise affecting more than 50% mass. Polymorph only. 24-hour cooldown and affected by minor morph cooldown. Minor morph spell. Design and save minor modifications under 10% mass. Up to 5 saved traits per 10 levels. Polymorph only. 8-hour cooldown after affecting more than 30% mass. Environmental barrier spell. Absorb nutrients and trace mana by crushing the juices from nearby plants. Creates a weak armor layer from the pulp. Running out of mana before releasing the residue results in shredded skin. Polymorph only. Dimensional Lab. Perk. A dimensional space designed to store and process chemicals. Spells, identification, breakdown, recipe record, experimental blending, and creation. Spells only available within laboratory. Note: Initiate's Apothecary class. Rare, toxic variation is only available to polymorphs. Scan. Research the properties of substances and systems to inform replication via morphing. Racial trait. Remorph skill. Easily returned to unaltered polymorph body, resized according to mass. Heals damage aside from suboptimal mass debuffs. Body morph skill. Alter appearance naturally by using a practical, practiced understanding of physical traits and the qualities of the tissue. DNA-based replicas become possible with skill mastery. Optimal mass. Optimal mass determines the scope of potential transformations. Morphing into shapes outside of optimal mass range comes with increasing debuffs. Non-standard mental makeup. Gives a high resistance to traditional mental and charisma influences. Reduces access to memories of physical pain and torturous experiences. Highly susceptible to manipulation by those who have experience, skills, spells for dealing with polymorphs. Absorb. Draw in mana, air, and nutrients via direct contact with fluids or atmosphere. Hibernation. Stay alert up to 7 days, followed by 22 hours of hibernation. Toxin resistance. Unaffected by most toxins. Purge. Filter toxins from blood and living tissue in self, and others when combined with absorb. A necessary first step before switching secreted toxins. Toxin production. Create and secrete a single toxin based on a tangible sample.